So we're going to just do just a few brief updates, and then there are a couple of articles this week that were particular noteworthiness, and one of them was a post by Chris about HIPAA that I thought it would be sort of relevant to the conversation, all our conversations. And since she has a limited amount of time, I'm going to ask her to just kind of say a few brief words. It was sent out in the weekly roundup that Amanda does, and is on the agenda here, so you can read it in more detail as well. And then I'll ask Brian to introduce our guest and talk a little bit about Direct, since Scott Stewie is with us today, and there was another article today about some work going on in Rochester with Direct. So pertinent timing on those two, to say the least. So, and then Adam will do just a brief update on where we're at on the scan, and then we'll spend most of our time talking about Direct with Scott, and Brian will do an introduction on that. So, welcome all. Oh, and we do have one other announcement, and we'll start off with a raffle. So, Chris, you mentioned that there's a couple of spots, so you might want to just say a bit about that as well. I'll turn it over to you. And if there's a rush to the we'll just have to take the longest straws, okay?
So the Network for Public Health Law is a member of All In, and All In is having its national meeting November 8th through the 10th, and we have a certain number of free registrations that we can offer to people. So we wanted to throw out to this group, because obviously the work is relevant, Daniel and Adam are going, but an additional 3 spots are available for folks. There may actually be more, but let's assume there are only 3 for now. And whoever's interested, I don't know, how you want to do it, Daniel? Just shoot me an email, throw it in the chat, and I'll follow it.
Yeah, why don't we put it, if people are interested, we can just type their name into the chat, and we can funnel those back to you. Amanda will send those off, and if there's a bunch, we'll see how we can triage them. So fast fingers help.
I'm accepting checks for places in line.
I'll throw a link in the chat for the conference itself if you want to. It's virtual, but you know.
Perfect.
Great. Thank you for that, Chris.
I will accept thanks on behalf of the organization.
That sounds great. It should be interesting. So with that, you want to say a little bit about the post as we get started here? I don't know when you need to jump off.
Yeah. So this is, I think this is probably something I've mentioned maybe in some smaller group discussions, but we just, we just put out an article on just trying to spread the word about something that is permitted under the current HIPAA provisions, even before we go through the new regulations that are coming in and the, the redraft or whatever that everyone keeps waiting to hear, waiting for. Basically it's that many people don't recognize that covered entities can actually share protected health information with non-clinical entities, like with social service organizations that are on the care team for the patient, without having to get express, written patient consent. Because if the care coordinator at the homeless shelter, or if the case manager at the mental health clinic, for example, or like a spin-off of the mental health clinic, if those people are a part of the individuals or the patient's care team, and perceived that way by the patient, certainly, then under the treatment prong of HIPAA, treatment, payment, and operations are the 3 prongs that you can share protected health information between and among covered entities without having to get express written patient consent. That the sharing information with the social service organization can fall under the treatment prong, and that's what allows you to be able to share information without having to get the written consent. And why that matters for people who aren't frontline on that issue is that sometimes things are more time sensitive, right? Or the client or the patient or the individual can't get back into the office to sign, a consent. and they just want a phone call made to the case manager at the domestic violence shelter they're staying at, or, you know, whatever, to be able to share information, for example, to give them appropriate information on what would be appropriate housing for someone who has medical needs or something like that. So the article is in the agenda. Go ahead and take a read. I'm happy to answer questions any other time, but it's just trying to put the word out about something that HIPAA already does provide for, that can be help people get access to social services a little faster, hopefully.
Thanks for that clarification. I think we'll want to make sure that that's kind of clearly articulated in the scan report as well, since it's especially particularly useful for the social determinant work and the integration of that in the consent sort of concepts, because those things can get lost. So we'll double check. I'm sure it's in there. If not, we'll just make sure we go back and highlight that or make it a call out box or something like that. So that should be great. Thanks, Chris. All sorts of other jewels in the weekly update. So I'd like to read those as we go forward. Adam,
actually, I'd like to add in one that didn't quite make it in.
Sure.
And that is that the ONC announced this week that they acknowledge that the U.S. Common Data Interoperability Requirements, US CDI, cannot always offer the consistency and alignment on data sets that some use cases require. And so they've launched the US CDI Plus initiative to help federal partners identify and establish interoperable data sets that meet their agency's specific requirements. And I think this is interesting because it basically, it's what it's saying is, oh, golly gosh, we've done a fine job of defining what ought to be built into EHRs, but it's such a broad set of potential data elements that we're not getting the kind of consistency and interoperability we want. So we're going to need to define some profiles. Welcome to the wonderful world of standards profiles. I just wanted to bring that up because at least in my little corner of the world, this is a big deal. And also, just in preparation for Scott's presentation, one of the articles was about the Rochester Rio, which has just announced that it's leveraging direct secure messaging to enhance provider-to-provider communication and boost care coordination. That's what that other article is all about. I'm afraid it doesn't say much more than what I just said, so I'm saving you the trouble of having to click through to it.
Well, it's definitely timely, and so I'm looking forward to hearing more from Scott about that as we move on. Adam, over to you. Any employments or just kind of an update for?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, can you give me control? Now I'm going to show a page or two. Everybody's worked so hard on this consent document. I think it's worth showing you the beginnings of the design. But it's very exciting. It's going to be real.
There you go. Just sent it over to you.
Okay. Everybody see it?
Nope.
Yeah.
No?
Nope.
I pressed sharing. Let me try it again. Let me reshare the resharing. Okay. How about now? Can you see it?
Yep. There you go.
Great. So, so this be it. That's the cover. It's kind of, it's simple but sharp, I think.
Snazzy.
Yeah, snazzy. It goes to acknowledgements page. Don't worry about this list. It's a work in progress of co-authors. And a thanks to Robert Wood Johnson, and a reference to where contributors are listed and so forth. And a table of contents, which is all wrong right now. And here we go. And this is the style and the format. I'm not going to go through all the pages. Basically what it looks like. And then it goes down. I'll just do a quick skim with, everybody is absolutely welcome if they want to, for the remaining content, not for this. This is done, but there's remaining content in the Google Doc. I should tell you this, as we send stuff to the designer, I'm removing it. Amanda's actually doing it. We're removing it from the Google Doc, so there's no accidental changes. These are done. If there are any fixes we need to do, we can do it in the proofreading. But whatever is here is done, and whatever is left in the Google Doc, you're free to insert comments and so forth. And that's it. It's taking shape, and it's going to be around 90 pages, which is frightening, but it's pretty well segmented. So I think people will be able to look in the table of contents and say, that's of interest, or that's irrelevant for me, whatever. The other thing that I'm just thinking out loud here, we are putting together a glossary. There are just a whole lot of terms that many people, probably including among us, won't get because they're from other fields. So we are going to put together a glossary, and I think I will pass that around a bit so that no one person has to provide definitions for 70 words. I don't know how many it'll be, but whatever it is. So if you're familiar with it or know a good source for, fine. If not, if you're too busy or don't want to get into it, that's fine. But I think it makes sense to spread that around a little bit. And I have no idea. I haven't discussed this with Daniel, but maybe we could ask for some help with proofreading. It's a lot of pages, and catching all the typos and any incorrect reference or anything of final nature like that. Yeah, the glossary should be valuable. I agree. And actually, it's worth passing around even if you do not have time to add anything to it, add any definitions, because what everybody can do is say, is something missing? That would be valuable as well. And that's it. I mean, we should be able to, I thought we would wrap it up this week. Some of the external input, no names, hasn't been finished. Nobody's fault, just hasn't come in yet. And so we're still, the straggling is still happening. And I certainly think we'll be done next week. And hopefully by Wednesday, we can show you a final product. So, and last but not least, as ever, we couldn't have done it without you. So thanks to everyone, big time.
We couldn't have done it without you, Adam. You deserve a round of applause for
He was the ringmaster, absolutely.
fully herding this incredible group of cats.
Well, thank you, Brian.
I don't think it's overstating it to say that this is pretty groundbreaking. I mean, I think all of us know going into this that there wasn't quite a single voluminous document that captured so many aspects of consent management, consent allowance, and what the landscape currently looks like. And so, I think this is going to have tremendous legs that we can take advantage of for.
Yeah, actually, a quick question. Do we know what the planned distribution of this is?
I can address that a little, and I want to address Jim's question about needing a 2-page brief sheet. I'm going to write a executive summary. So that's, I think, to your point.
Yes, sir. Executive summary is good, but then there's also kind of like something we're going to hand to members of Congress that they read the salient points that captures it in no more than 2 pages.
Well, I'm hoping that they're one and the same. Honestly, I think that it can be 2 pages. It should be 2 pages, or at least maybe, I don't know. I've done a lot of these over time, so I've done them in 2 pages and 10 pages. Nobody reads the 10. So I'll give it my best shot, but I get it. I get the briefing points. Absolutely right. They need to be very clear. In terms of distribution, good that everybody's here. So we will distribute it as widely as we can. I think for the purposes of instigating next steps, that's really important. Nobody's going to participate or fund anything if they don't know it exists. That'll be like a rule. So we will do it through NIC. We will do it through SOCI. We will absolutely, I think RWJF will help as the funder. And we will ask everybody who participated if you would please distribute it through your own list. If that really happens, including through, if you want to write a blog about it for your, for each one for their own publication purposes, if you want to use social media, put it out in social media. If you multiply all the people we have just who actually participated in this thing, and if everybody, sort of chips in a bit, that's going to be damn wide distribution. And then we need to put together a targeted list, as you said, Jim, to the Hill. Who else has to get it? Whose eyes have to be on it? And they should get, an email, a communication saying, this one's for you, and get it out into the world. I think distribution of this one is particularly important.
We shall distribute on the beaches. We shall distribute on the land. We shall distribute in the fields and in the streets.
Okay, we're going to put Brian out on the street. And everybody else.
With the copy, the rag copy.
Read all about it.
Put a cigar in my mouth before you do.
Hey, Adam, I'd like to ask I'm sorry, Matt, did you want to go ahead?
No, you go ahead.
Adam, this is this is a huge project, obviously, and there's a lot of information in it. I remember seeing comments from maybe a week ago, Norm Arts. I can't remember how to.
No. Yeah.
Okay.
We know.
And, I wasn't around if there were any group conversations like this about his feedback. So my question is, was that feedback like discussed? And then kind of a related question is, given that your nose has been so deep in this, for all this time, Adam, do you think that have you been able to do this step back and look at it critically again, or do you have to have someone else to do it? Do you have any concerns about its length, which I think was one of the points that Norm brought up?
I have concerns about its length, and I think there's nothing to do about it. I think it is what it is. We need a good executive summary. I'm making this up off the top. Maybe we need a 2-page version and a 10-page version. I don't know. But no, I have not. I've been in the weeds, and I do need to step back from it and sort of look at it, the gestalt of it, and say, how does it hang together? I think to your point about your question about Noam, yeah, we addressed the questions that he raised. We talked about it internally. We made some change. I don't know if you're thinking of anything specific, but the answer to each one is yes.
Okay.
I would add to your point, Chris. I thought Noam was a really thoughtful guy and well experienced in research and publication stuff like that. So I take what he says very seriously. I think that the way I've been thinking about it is almost kind of like a syllabus as a way. And so I don't think we have the means to sort of separate. So just for other people's purposes, Noam came back and said, maybe you should distribute this as sort of like 5 editions, or, like send it out as part 1, part 2, part 3, whatever. Because there's a legal part, there's a technical part, there's promising practices, all these different components to it, which I think adds to the comprehensiveness of at least sort of a broad level. Again, at this point, I don't think we're sort of resourced to be able to sort of take those into creating 5 separate pieces. However, one thing we certainly should think about, and I'm open to that discussion as well, if we want to redistribute it in that manner. But in my conversations a little bit with ONC recently, there's interest in this consent work. And so maybe what we are doing is we're sort of presenting parts of it, or we set up a multi-series webinar over the next couple of months where we focus in on kind of high level, and then we go into each of the parts, or we do some kind of simultaneous, sort of breakout groups. People can break into, the legal side, the technical side, and then we bring people back together again and have more of a comprehensive kind of conversation around it. It presents a lot of just grist for the mill, so to speak. And so how we use it and how each of you can use it or continue to sort of contribute to it will be an important part of the conversation, I think.
So, oh, sorry.
Yeah,
So
no,
what-
I was just going to, one last point, and you were saying, Adam, is that I think from a social media perspective, we can also help sort of provide some templates for folks. I think this is a very good LinkedIn kind of post for folks potentially. And
Yeah,
people
I
care
was
about
thinking that.
this.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we can
And actually, if
provide
we
that.
have Daniel, I was just thinking if we have the 2-pager, it might be along lines what you were saying as a syllabus, as a guide to parts of it you'd want to read. And in fact, I don't know if we have plans to do this, but it might be helpful to be sort of like a set of links on a web page so that people can read the relevant sections that of interest. And if we put this out on LinkedIn or something, it can include a link to the site with a sort of an interactive experience, so to speak. I think this is going to be an important bibliography item for people, and the wider we can distribute it, the better, I think.
So one idea that I had that I didn't pursue, this was in direct response to Noam's comments. And I think Daniel and I talked about it briefly, and it's a resource issue. I mean, how much time can we continue to put into, to be blunt, the grant from RWJF was this big, and the effort has been, much, much bigger. So it's a resource issue in part. But one idea would be, and that would be fairly simple, is to set up a page on our website where you have the full document. You can call it the full document, but you can also have it in pieces. So it's a cover with introduction, a cover with technical issues, a cover with legal issues. So it could be broken apart so people can, and this is sort of
Yes, exactly.
for you as well, Tom. I mean, you could sort of just look at the page with the labeled sections and just call up that section. You wouldn't need a link. You wouldn't need to go into the full report. You could just touch it and you'd be where you want to be.
Yeah, I think the idea of having anchors within the document to link to the sections is a great one. My comment was on the topic of promoting it and getting other people to share it. We might want to reach out to the Karen Alliance and any other community that often talks about like data ownership, because consent is oftentimes like part of that conversation of like, okay, you can control once we get identity, then you can control your consents for, sharing data. Or once you own your data, then you'll be able to control access to who gets it, right? So there's kind of like these neighboring universes where these conversations are happening, and that might be interested in this work. So.
Yeah, and actually, we could sort of leverage the network a little bit, Matt, in that regard, to get this into the hands of folks like MyHIN, New York eHealth Collaborative, these groups that have audiences of audiences, to
HIMSS.
basically distribute this far and wide.
Yeah, I mean, HIMSS, MyHIN, we have relationships with all these folks, and again, all of you have relationships. Some of them, overlap with us, and some do not. So if we can leverage the people who have participated in this project, I think we'll get pretty well out into the world.
And everyone we interviewed too.
And everyone we interviewed too.
All right, well, it's exciting to be coming to I don't know, call it finish line or the starting line. It's being able to redistribute and actually have the conversations, actually go do stuff around this, right? Because the whole purpose is sort of inform the go do part of this, and hopefully we'll be successful with that as well.
Two
Yeah,
more
and I would-
two more quick sentences.
Yeah.
Very exciting part of this, if we can pull it off, if we can get the funding, will be a symposium. I mean, that would be a gas to talk about looking at all the pieces of this with really interesting presenters and content and ideation, and that's real thought leadership to try to launch something like that. That'll be fun.
Well, that may be in the cards with some help from some of our federal partners, or
Yeah.
parts of it might be, which would be great to own that. So great. Any last comments on this part of the conversation? Okay, so let me turn it over to Brian and Scott to talk to us about about Direct today, which is the topic of conversation, and the rest of the time to do that. So Brian, you want to?
Actually, specifically about that in August, Direct Trust acquired the assets of Safe Identity, including its trust framework. And as we know from all of our work on person identity and person matching and consent, a trust framework is really critical to identity assurance and the associated security and privacy of information exchange. Cribbing from the press release, Scott, so my apologies, but the Safe Identity acquisition extends Direct Trust's tools for managing policies and providing the infrastructure that issues secure and identity assured credentials for electronic transactions in healthcare. I am delighted to introduce Scott Stewie, who's the president and CEO of Direct Trust, to tell us more about this exciting acquisition. Welcome to Project Unify, Scott. And now you're on, Scott, but you have to unmute.
Yes, I figured that out. So it was yelling at me that I was muted, so it was right. So I'm trying to figure out how to share. So let me do that real quick. Do you have to grant me that permission?
Yeah, I think I gave it to you. You just have to go, if you just go to share screen on the bottom, if you're not a Zoom user.
Yeah, it's not working yet. There we go. Now it is.
Okay, great. There you go. Looks like
All right. Well,
Excellent.
so thanks, Brian, for the introduction, and really thank you all for the audience here. And just to be clear, I'm actually quite interested in your consent document of interest to us as well, and we can be counted on to be a conduit for sharing that out. So I think we are a constituency of constituencies as well. So let me tell you a little bit about Direct Trust. Some of what you might think you know about Direct might be maybe an incomplete story. So I want to try and give you as complete a story as well as describe this acquisition and kind of how we think it has an impact in healthcare. This will kind of be what I cover. And it's really a pretty short discussion. So I'll definitely leave time for some Q&A. But so the first thing to know is that yes, Direct Trust purchased the assets of Safe Identity, and Direct Trust Identity is basically a component of the Direct Trust organization that will basically house the Safe Identity goodies. And so there's several aspects of what Safe Identity brought in, but let me first give you a sense of why this makes sense for Direct Trust at some level first. So I think most folks, when they think of Direct Trust, they think of Direct, and our first name is important and is our raison d'etre, right? So we got stood up principally because there was a desire to, Direct Trust actually did not emerge to make direct secure messaging work. That's not why Direct Trust happened. Okay, Direct Trust happened because in the beginning of direct secure messaging, the operators of the network had to have pairwise relationships with each other in order to make the trust work. They had to actually literally have contracts with one another and test connectivity pairwise. And at that time, there's roughly 20 or 30 organizations that are trying to manage this network. It was a problem for the, just for the mathematics of the problem. You can't manage that many connections without a kind of a network in place. So what was needed was a fabric for trust. And so trust is really the core element that's underneath direct secure messaging. Now, I think probably most everybody here understands what direct secure messaging is, but let me just make sure so I don't leave anybody behind. But direct secure messaging is a trusted communication mechanism that is embedded in all electronic health record systems by fiat. Basically, in stage 2 meaningful use, there was an obligation to use direct secure messaging. Direct secure messaging provides the ability for endpoints to communicate with other endpoints, knowing only their direct address. And if you know their direct address and you know that is a part of the direct community, really only those only direct addresses can talk to other direct addresses. So it's basically identity assured communication that is also encrypted. The actual message is encrypted, not the tunnel, if you will. So most encryption models are they basically encrypt the tunnel. This basically allows for the message itself to be encrypted so that only the intended recipient can decrypt the message. And so what this allows for is for a lot of interesting use cases that depend on really the knowledge of the sender to basically inform the transaction, as opposed to query models where there have to be a lot of smarts built into, if something's going to be automatically queried for, the consent is a bigger issue in that setting, where when you are pushing data, it is less of a concern, particularly if you can be absolutely certain to whom you are pushing it. So that's direct secure messaging. But direct trust as an organization was the trust framework that accredited the bodies that were a part of that group of network operators. So there are 3 kinds of network operators in the direct trust community: the ones that actually do services for the endpoints that actually provide that direct secure messaging capability to. The example you gave, Secure Exchange Solutions recently became a HISP, which is what these network operators are called, for the Rochester Rio organization. Actually, Rochester Rio used to be their own HISP and recently got out of the HISP business and had Secure Exchange Solutions do that for them. So that's that accreditation that we do, that Direct Trust does, both of the network operators, the people who actually implement the standard that direct secure messaging represents, as well as the certificate authorities that issue the certificates and the registration authorities that manage to a high level of identity assurance. Those 3 roles are all 3 accredited by Direct Trust for this community. Okay, so that's historically what we've done. And I don't know that the trust aspect of Direct Trust is well understood. We are a PKI-based trust framework today, or we have been since our inception. What SAFE represented was really what I think of them as they have been our sister trust framework almost since our beginning. Actually, they existed before we did, and I'll have a timelines slide that can give you a sense of that. But our origin stories are very similar. We both came to being because a federal agency said something needed to happen. Okay, so in the case of Direct Trust, the Office of the National Coordinator actually stood us up at some level. In fact, 2 years of a cooperative agreement was a part of Direct Trust's early days. So Direct Trust was built so that the HISP community could scale. That was the whole purpose of establishing Direct Trust at its beginning. But it was also meant to establish a self-sustaining approach to how it is we can manage this trust over time and continue to grow and service that community as its needs change. So that's Direct Trust's origin story. Safe Identity's direct origin story is with the FDA. So the FDA is concerned about the veracity of the data that's being sent to the FDA from thousands of submitters. These are all of the pharmaceutical companies and CROs. So basically, anybody who wants to say anything about what is happening in the manufacturing process of how medications are being manufactured and developed, as those reports are being issued and then being submitted to the FDA, identity assurance is a requirement. So you need to know that that those documents are in fact do in fact come from, you know, GlaxoSmithKline or from AstraZeneca or whoever else. So that has been Safe Identity's origin story. They started their world with secure, scalable submission of documents. So basically, they're about document signing, where Direct Trust was about simple, secure healthcare information transport. So, but the trust framework underneath looks virtually identical. So they're very, very similar in terms of what they do, but they do them for different constituencies and for different use cases. So here are the sort of the timelines of all this. Again, growing up kind of side by side at some level, Safe Biopharma was a not-for-profit trade association, as is Direct Trust. So we're both not-for-profits with not-for-profit mission statements, but we also serve a community of not only of the companies that utilize these capabilities, but their relying parties. So it's a community of the issuers of those certificates, as well as other credentials, as well as the parties that will rely on them because they want to set the policies that they will actually then utilize. So that's kind of what these two trust frameworks did. Safe Biopharma starting in 2005, Direct Trust in 2010. There was a period that Safe Biopharma spent as a subsidiary of HISAC, and then they were acquired by for-profit company Safe Identity for just about a year and a half. And Direct Trust acquired the assets from Safe Identity and brought those back in under a not-for-profit umbrella just in September. So that's kind of the history. So it isn't, as I said, it's not incoherent, but I think it'll be clearer why we did it when you see this set of stuff. So this is really, you know, if you look at our roadmap, the two different organizations and what it is they were working on prior to the acquisition, a conversation between myself and Kyle Newman began almost a year and a half ago when we started trying to figure out, well, how do these trust frameworks interoperate with each other? How do they federate? What do they need to do to have equivalent expectations for identity assurance and such? So we had those conversations. We started talking about it, but this is sort of, you know, what I think led to the realization that it might make better sense if we were just one trust framework. So on the Safe Identity side, you know, their core use case is 21 CFR Part 11. That's the digital report submission and document signing associated with the FDA, where Direct Trust's core use case is direct secure messaging. But moving beyond that, there are numerous things that Direct Trust has done on our side that actually relate in part to the fact that we're also a standards development organization. We launched an ANSI accredited standards development organization last year. And so as a part of that, we have some additional standards work. We did notifications work that was we were actually approached by the EHR industry to say, hey, can you help us figure this out? Because nobody's doing this in a way that we think will actually work for us in short order. So there was already a lot of use of direct secure messaging for communicating notifications. That's the notifications required under the CMS rule, the patient access rule that requires event notifications. That is to say, like admissions, transfers, and discharges to be communicated to primary care or to other downstream providers from hospitals. That obligation was, you know, this year, about mid-year last year, the EHR companies came to us and said, holy moly, can you help us with this? So it was, we got that together pretty quickly. It's actually almost complete. And actually most folks have already started their development process. So that's work we were working on. We also did a piece of work on what's called trusted instant messaging, which is associated with, it's basically the same idea as direct secure messaging. Direct secure messaging is secure email transport, but it's also transport, not strictly email. In other words, it's not necessarily an email client you see when you use direct secure messaging. It might not appear like an email at all, but behind the scenes, it is fundamentally SMIME or secure email. What trusted instant messaging is it takes the same approach that direct secure messaging took, but taking it to instant messaging platforms to enable for instant message platforms to communicate with each other. So wouldn't it be nifty, for example, if we could use Zoom and somebody else could use GoToMeeting or whatever they wanted, and we wouldn't have to be constantly changing platforms as we do. Like, I don't know about you, but I probably used 4 today. So but in a different kind of a context, this is actually much more important. So if you're a healthcare system and you want to have just one tool for this purpose, you would like to be able to have that to be able to be communicable with other platforms, because people are deploying their platforms and expecting everyone to buy their platform. What direct secure messaging is about, and what direct is about generally, is enabling what I would call a multiplayer game. So in other words, in an environment where there are lots of competitors and they basically say you have to get everything from us, direct is basically an antidote to that, where you basically say, no, you don't have to get everything from one person. You can use interoperability to make it so that you can use whatever platform you like and talk to the other platform using your workflow. So that's kind of what, what I think of interoperability as generally is, one person's workflow can stay their workflow, and yet they can interact in a very, very fundamentally complete way with another system. That's what, when interoperability works well, that's what it looks like. So that was what we did in trusted instant messaging. So now we're transitioning into things that I think really, so we in the course of thinking about what we were going to do to expand the scope of our use case roadmap at Direct Trust, consumer credentials was a big focus because I think there's a gap and a clear concern in the marketplace around consumer credentials and the way that the interoperability rule requires consumers to know the different usernames and passwords for all the different portals that they use. So if you've got 23 portals, if you're a cancer patient and you have to remember all those usernames and passwords, then the chances of you actually being able to get your records together, even though there will be the ability to get this data in a smartphone app, the chances you're going to be able to do that without interoperable credentials is going to be challenging for you. It's going to mean you have to do a lot of work. And so I think we were focused on this topic long before the discussion with Safe Identity began. But Safe Identity, when we started talking to them, we realized that this is something that they were also working on. And we also then had a conversation that began at Karen that included both Safe Identity and Cantera. And we started talking about, well, what does it require for the trust frameworks to trust one another? What do you do to make it so that a credential that's issued by one trust framework can be trustable across the ecosystem? What does that look like? So that's work that we were actively working on before the Safe Identity work, actually in conversations with Safe and Cantera at Karen. So
let me just interrupt for 1 second.
Yes.
This is great. I have a question, and I know Jim has a question. Let me just pause for a second if you're okay with that.
Yes.
And so we don't get too far down the road. Jim, you want to, what was on your mind?
I appreciate that, my friend, and I can come in at any time, but I did want to say I was very excited about this slide. And speaking now in my new capacity with Linux Foundation Public Health, Linux Foundation has done tremendous amount of work, either internal to LF or in partnership with Sovereign and other organizations around consumer credentials. I've spoken about it before here, and I think you've seen that, as well as expanding into IOMT, IoT security and credentials, and would love to find a way for us to collaborate at some point.
And I think there's one of the things that we are discovering is that even as you work outside of the PKI realm, you work down the stack of virtually anything, and sooner or later you encounter PKI most of the time. Yep. So I do think there's a collaborative model here. I think that there's also a continuum, because in the near term, for certain use cases, PKI is dominant and will continue to be dominant because the organizations that deploy in those spaces are fairly conservative. But technology doesn't stand still. So standards are constantly evolving, and their adoption is not goes in fits and starts. So I think we need to figure out how it not only how it it's how it progresses over time. We need to figure out, as well as how it can how these things can interoperate, because I think there's going to be circumstances where we need PKI as a mechanism to establish organizational identity, and also to communicate effectively aspects of policy, which are sort of the PKI realm's power alley, where other aspects of PKI are not very useful, or not as useful when you get into the settings of smartphones and and hundreds of thousands of users. I mean, it's a different use case and a different problem set. So I'm in agreement that I think that these two things are a little different, but I think that they have value to each other.
Let me offer 30 seconds of exuberant affirmation, then I'll shut up. I've been trying to convey exactly what you said to Ryan at Karen Alliance. We, as the decentralized identity community, see it as a hybrid, and the trust frameworks we're working on now are intended to be hybrid because, for instance, around the vaccination credentials, the EU is using a PKI-based model with X509. We're looking at using the new W3C DID standards. Those two have to be able to talk to each other. And there's going to be times when, quite frankly, the most elegant solution is going to be PKI-based, and other solutions, especially around IOMT, and other parts of the solution where for privacy preservation, zero trust, whatever, you're going to want to use DIDs. So I think you're speaking my language. I'd love to chat with you about it.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you. I mean, when I took over Direct Trust, it's been about 3 years. I proposed a pivot from a focus on direct to a pivot to a focus on trust. And if to my way of thinking, trust is the durable element here. PKI is not necessarily durable, nor is, for that matter, neither is fire. Neither is anything. Everything will pass. So you have to think about things in terms of what your core competencies are. We're a policy engine. That's what we do. We create policy, and we create consensus around that policy from a multi-stakeholder environment, so that we can represent people appropriately. So that's I think that's our superpower. I think the technology itself is not the point. It's actually the policy. The advantage of PKI also is that the policy it's very rigid, right? So you can actually look at a certificate policy from one organization and compare it to another just like this. It's just so easy, because they're identical. They comply to an RFC. They look identical. So sort of like Robert's Rules of Order. If you go to one board meeting, go to another board meeting, all the same stuff happens, right? So that's the way it feels in a PKI trust framework. So in any case, you're right. IOMT is very much of an interest. It was less of an interest to Direct Trust. It was definitely an area where SAFE was really focused. The Drug Supply Chain Security Act is an area where there is actually fairly vigorous interest, I think, in PKI, because I think they have a huge, I would compare this to what happened in the notification space, where in notifications, the EHRs, a bunch of IGs got written to use various new approaches to solve for notifications based on either FHIR or extensions of XDS approaches for exchange. So those things got written, but when push came to shove, and the HR said, well, what do we have that's actually working now for push messaging? It's direct. And so they came to us and asked us to convene this discussion. That's kind of how this happened. And Dan, I'm sorry, I would definitely leave an air space here in just a second. Sorry. Let me finish this thought. But so that notion, I think, of notifications is similar to this idea of DSCSA, where in DSCSA, there's, I think, a desire to move toward new approaches for some of the aspects of this, but there are some who are concerned that you won't be able to get to it fast enough. You won't be able to get people identity assured fast enough if you don't have a lot of players at the table. So I think we believe that there is a role for direct trust in this space. It's been a very interesting 6 weeks since the start of the acquisition. I've probably been to 15 hours of meetings on the Drug Supply Chain Security Act. It is a really interesting thing. And actually, if you look at the picture of what that looks like, it looks actually quite a lot like direct secure messaging. It's similar in terms of what it requires. It's not similar technically, but Dan, I'm sorry, go ahead, you had a question.
No, I was just actually just kind of roll back a little bit. When you said that you've now translated this to beyond email to basically text messaging, if that's correct.
Yes.
So is that at the consumer level, or how is that different, or how is that the same? Because I feels like it's a really important thing, especially for the kind of consent stuff that we're talking about here. Could you just spend I don't want to,
No, it's an important thing for this group to understand. So it at this point in time, what it is a standard only, Dan. So its ability to be utilized in a consumer context is absolutely possible. So what's in our policies at this point, we actually have written a kind of a draft policy for trusted instant messaging, but that's separate from the standard. What we built so far is just the standard piece. So like somebody who has an instant messaging platform can use our standard to communicate with another instant messaging platform that also complies with that same capability. And they don't have to actually change what they do. They just have to use XMPP and the trust framework componentry to make it work. But it doesn't actually require our trust framework per se. It's a standard that could use any trust community's environment, if that makes sense. But it does allow for that trust. It is based currently on a PKI-based trust model. So that's what that's about. Does that explain what that's about, Dan?
Yeah, I think it does at the level right now that I need to understand it.
Yeah, so definitely of interest for consumers. And I think, Brian, as we've been talking about how this relates to what the folks in Project Unify are doing and others, I think Brian has his eye on this as a potential place where this would be valuable. So, but at this point, in fact, the electronic health record vendors are, you could say they're busy. They're kind of like, they got all these regulatory flies around their head, which is, they have to do whatever is required for the information blocking rule, which is non-trivial, right? It's a ton of work for them. So that means that when it comes to doing new things, they're not really apt to sign up for things right now. They're not ready to do something new. And yet, I think there are a lot of other industries where this kind of interoperable model would be very useful. So for example, in the world you all work in, if an instant messaging platform capability were available in one of the companies that serves the community services space, and they wanted to talk to users in the other platform, they could use this standard to support it. So I do think that's of interest. I know that Brian finds it interesting. I don't know whether it ends up being what people decide to do, but I think it's a valid use case to consider.
That's great.
Many of us are very interested in this, so we're delighted to have you here.
Well, and I'm really excited to get to know you all better. So let me just make sure that we get through this before, and so there's time for general questions at the end. I've only probably got a couple more slides. I won't spend very much time on this, but this is just, historically, Direct Trust has spent a ton of time sort of, talking about our network and its growth. And our network growth is important and valuable and all that. But what we're actually more focused on right now is trying to improve use and usability. I think that's probably true for all of the folks who are in the electronic health record business. They would like to see this stuff work better. So it's not so much that it doesn't work. I call it the last inch. We're really focused on the last inch. For a long time, it was the last mile. The last inch is really where the problems are. We're connected, but we're not, at least in the electronic health record space, we're connected, but we're not using things because they're not very usable. And that's That's a fundamental problem. So here's the sort of a high level set of things that we're imagining how this works. We are also imagining that we'll make an explicit cross certification between what direct trust represents and what safe identity represents. So making it possible for one trust framework to trust one another, the other inside of our four walls. But then in the patient identity space, we're actively working on a collaboration that includes Cantera and Safe and Direct Trust. But now, of course, Safe and Direct Trust are one thing, as well as ENAC in support of that notion. I think it's Jim, right? Jim St. Clair, do I have that right?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Okay, I was blanking on your first name, but I did.
That's all right.
I had it right, which is like 1 in a million chance. But so this, I think this is an example of that kind of thing I was describing, where there's a need for PKI in order to stitch things together. In order to make that work, a standard that's deploying now called UDAP is gaining traction with the folks at ONC and has been written into the care quality work. That UDAP stuff basically allows for the JOTs that are being signed by apps with identities that are provided to them by a non-PKI IDP. You need to have a way of stamping your policies somewhere and communicating that to the relying party, and also make clear to whom you are speaking and who you are. So those organizations need to be identity assured, never mind the individual users, which of course also need to be identity assured, but the technology and the mechanism by which that identity assurance is managed and communicated might be different than the organizational identity of the app and the IDP and the relying party, who might actually have to go get additional information from the IDP. So that's actually what that UDAP standard is meant to support. And so that's kind of what we're working on. That UDAP stuff work has been happening over the course of the last couple of years. And it is now it's as a part of work at HL7. So anyway, that's kind of what's happening in the broad scope. And then I think I want to make sure that we, I think I'm about done with time here, aren't I? I got, do I need to, I've got 2 more slides. I think I'm okay.
And I'll throw really quick in there, Scott. I've talked with the folks at UDAP too, and without going back to that slide you have, that's where, to your point, there's areas where PKI can stitch things together, but there's technical limitations for this group around some of to fully enable some of Kantara's work and some of the things we're doing in consent models. You need to be able to have the decentralized or distributed consent management mechanisms in our architecture that can live in a complementary fashion to use cases and processes that want to leverage PKI.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. And I think so for instance, even in DSCSA, it's considered that it's likely that there will be a distributed ledger for communicating,
right,
who's a part of the trusted community, the ATPs, that set of players are needing some place for, there needs to be a registry for those players. So that's.
And I'll throw out, I'm sorry, 30 more seconds, everybody can roll their eyes at me. But on the medical IoT side, one of the things we've been examining closely, I've been examining and promoting a conversation, is how it relates to a zero trust architecture. So from a true security standpoint, presume that the medical IoT devices are in an adversarial environment. So each device has to continuously authenticate to the other, as well as maybe reserve what it chooses to share with other devices on the network. And whereas a traditional PKI federated model basically says, I am who I say I am, and you have to know who I am, the decentralized approach allows for sharing a cryptographic trust that also allows them to authenticate in a trust framework, but still limit what they're sharing with each other for adversarial expectations.
Yeah, and I think we've been working closely with the folks at the Center for Medical Interoperability, who I think have had some very industry leading thinking about this. They actually came to our first information session on the IOMT use case. So we're eager to kind of, again, collaborate, as you say, Jim, with the rest of the community here, because it's not there won't be a single technology. There will be a profile that is made up of many things to solve these problems. So that's that story. Let me go to the next. So we kind of went past this very quickly, but I mean, we talk about this notion of federation. I'm not 100% sure people know what it means. You know what it means to kind of what role a trust framework has. This slide I think is useful, but it's actually just taken directly from 863C. So this is coming right off the NIST documents. So this is actually a useful thing to understand, so people can figure out who's a part of the game here, who's playing and what their roles are. The trust framework is, we are fundamentally the rules, the legal, the conformance, the expectations that are placed on the parties, and they so that's kind of what we do and what we expect to do ongoing. If you have information, questions about how all this works, and you don't understand still, we've got, I think, relatively good frequently asked questions fleshed out on our website that you can just hit. I'll send this in the chat so you can find it, but it's pretty straightforward. And so that if you've got additional questions, it's easy to ask them to us, but you can also find most of them answered. I would like to think here at the frequently asked questions site. So I'll stop and let other folks ask questions. That's really what I want to make sure you know. Just to recap, Direct Trust and Safe Identity are one organization now. We actively seek to play a central role in how healthcare information is exchanged from a technical trust standpoint. So that's we're very much focused on that. We're a policy engine first, and not a technologically focused. I mean, the standards are important. We'll develop standards, but we also will profile standards that already exist, rather than necessarily try and muscle our way into a standard that is operating effectively. So that's our thinking.
Cool. Well, covered a lot of territory there. Yay. Is this your team?
Oh, that actually is that's the Direct Trust community from 3 years ago, I guess. Lots of good folks. This is I try and make sure this is what I have up instead of my budget or my or pictures of my plants. But in any case, yeah, so bigger community now, but this was our first in-person summit 3 years ago.
Hey. So floor is open. We've got a little time to kind of dive into some of the questions or considerations.
I think Matt is first in line.
Nope, hands up. Great. Use the hands up. I like that. That's great. Go for it, Matt.
Hey, Scott, thanks for joining us. So I definitely, I'm super, excited about Direct, as you know, and I think the strength in having, greater security, so much level of assurance that, the information you're sending is going to who you're intending it to send, so that, you're less risk for kind of HIPAA violations, to compare it to like the email. Email is incredibly easy to spoof. I can pretend, I'm Barack Obama, very, very easily. So there's a lot of value in that. And then from the trust frameworks, we're particularly interested in the intersection of healthcare and human services, right? Because right now what's happening on the ground is when healthcare and human service organizations form partnerships to address the social determinants, they have to come to a common agreement. The lawyers have to come to a common agreement on their interpretation of the law, right? Of like, okay, how are we recording consent? All these different elements of these frameworks. And then they kind of have these one-off data sharing agreements on a partnership by partnership level. So could you talk about how trust frameworks might help to solve kind of these challenges of alignment of healthcare and human services around not just a standard that's compliant with the law, but also with something that's much more scalable. So you're not having to kind of bring the lawyers in each time you have these partnerships. And then the one trade-off that I wanted to ask you about in terms of identity assurance is that, you know, for patients that are like homeless or have less access to identity, like a driver's license or things to prove they are who they say are there things that can be thought of in the standard as this gets exchanged with information for exchange for human services, things that can happen in the standard that can try to kind of meet those needs or meet the same kind of level of identity assurance that we want for everybody for these populations?
Well, I think that there are things that can be done. I think that actually, if you consider some of the work they've done in the Vaccine Credentials Initiative, for example, I think that's really interesting in terms of, you know, basically producing a QR code that embeds information that allows you to get, you know, reliably to an identity. You know, so of course you can also photocopy that thing. So you have to have it more, you got to have more control than just the QR code. But there's some really clever things that you can do. I think if you you know, to get the physical world and cyberspace to get a connection that feels comfortable. So the advantage of direct certainly is that it's a very low cost mechanism to make communications happen, and it's actually, you know, interestingly, and I think people don't probably understand this, it's actually possible to utilize direct secure messaging on virtually any mail client. So it's not, you wouldn't be able to use it in such a way that you could then like send a message from your Gmail account to a direct account. That does not work. You cannot do it. But you could use the same client and just change accounts into a direct account. I mean, it's not actually that difficult to deploy something that works for people who have relatively little in the way of. Now, if you had nothing, you know, like, I'm not sure how you solve for interoperability with people who aren't automated, you know, at any level. That's a sort of a challenge that I'm not sure I'm willing to deal with. But what that generally means is that they have to be served by someone who is, right? So in that environment, they have to be, you know, as, you know, like a consumer that doesn't have a computer goes to a library and uses the library's computer. I mean, that's, I'm not suggesting that that's a very scalable approach, but that is in fact how that gets bridged in a lot of circumstances today if they need a machine. So
I mean, maybe there's some kind of regulatory approach where, you know, where proofs of identity could be registered, you know, in accordance with some kind of trust authority, right? Like the actual document itself, right? And that would mean that, like, go ahead. Sorry, Daniel.
It looked like Jim was nodding authoritatively.
Oh, I was nodding up and down. Yeah, the whole purpose of a trust registry is to provide a framework between the identity holder, the credential issuer, and a verifier to be able to say, I'm not going to tell you more about myself than I choose to disclose, but I'm presenting a credential from an issuer that you can trust because we both use this trust registry, or it's part of a trust registry characteristic. And then other than that, I was just going to add, you have to be careful with QR codes because they're like radioactivity. It can be used for good or evil.
Yes,
and I can tell you from personal experience, the Canadian ICO has ripped up various models for QR codes and the smart health cards falls into this. The model for using the QR code allows for inadvertent disclosure of more information than you may be choosing to share with an individual. So how that QR code is presented and the sharing framework behind it is essential for GDPR privacy type controls.
Totally agree. And the other thing is, Matt, just in general terms, you know, PKI in general is very good at a couple of things. Okay, one thing it's really, really good at is validating an individual can sign a document or virtually any digital item. Okay, any digital item can be signed, and basically individual is then claiming that this has veracity, right? So the organization or the individual that stamps their digital signature on something says, this is mine, this is true, this is, I'm willing to do this, this is my, whatever that is. So that's a fundamental capability of a trust framework in general, but of cryptographic capabilities in particular, because those cryptographic capabilities allow you to create an absolutely immutable story about this object. So you're claiming that this object is so. For example, one thing that when you think about release of information as a business, right, which is a very strange and scary business. I spent a year in it. It's positively peculiar. But in the release of information business, one of the hardest problems is this consent problem, which is to say, I'm going to get a HIPAA authorization with the actual request. And most data holders refuse to release the data without putting their eyes on the auth. And that is because the risk that they feel is so high because they have absolutely no idea whether this is in fact the patient. Okay. Well, here's the funny thing about that. Most of their workflow today is fax-based. They receive this stuff by a fax, and there's a wet signature on the fax cover sheet that says, that Jim St. Clair said it's okay to release his records. Okay. And Jim's signature, his wet signature is on there. It's like a scrawl. Like, who the heck believes that that's necessarily Jim St. Clair who signed that document? How do we know that? There is no indication whatsoever. So it seems to me that there's a potential for a lot more automation in a circumstance where you can actually have computable consent, because you can provide signed verifiable information that says I can go back to find out that this is in fact the person in question. So as opposed to a wet signature on a fax, which is, it's ludicrous that that's the way we do things today. And that's the way the majority of healthcare information exchange, is still done, not by Commonwealth or Care Quality, but by the ROI vendors paying for transactions that are done in this way. Faxes forward, faxes back. That is the state of the art for the majority of transactions still in healthcare. So I should think we should be able to do better than that.
Yeah, and I'll throw a chat I'll throw a link in the chat for a meetup that's coming up. We have one of our member companies developed a machine readable governance open source software platform, with the idea being to intake and process a machine readable governance framework around that idea for the rules and exchanging identity.
This is, I think, really, really interesting stuff. And I think this is the work that is yet to be completed. That is most important. I don't think that the other. I'm sorry. Adam,
Little background noise there.
I'm sorry. I think I thought he was trying to get a word in, but I think he's just was not muted. But I think that this is work that is not yet done that would be very interesting to advance, because I think it's the unsolved problem, right? And so it sounds like you all have spent a ton of time thinking about, consent as a general proposition. I'm eager to read your document, but I think that this question of making it computable when it's received in a request is, I think, a very interesting one to be considered.
That's definitely an area that we're at least touching upon, and some of that comes out of the work from San Diego LEAP grant on the computable consent there. So we're trying to build off of that, so it'll be useful. Again, from the start of the conversation, this initial scan is really not, be all end all. It's really the start of a bunch of different conversations, not the start, but the continuation of a bunch of different conversations that, are relevant obviously in healthcare, but also in other areas that have as much, if not more, sort of criticality to sharing information only with the right people at the right moment in time. So, we have a few more minutes. I go back to Brian, if you're still on here. Yeah, there you are. Our real particular focus area, in addition to healthcare, recognizing that's where so much of the momentum is is on connecting, and I know you've been in these conversations already with us in different ways, but just if we could spend a couple minutes on, how do you effectuate the exchange of information on a very accessible, low cost, low tech basis for people who have to exchange stuff like absenteeism for their children, right? Or attendance information or probation, or very, very tightly controlled child welfare information, those kinds of things. So I just want to put that on the table for just a couple minutes. Anything sensitive, exactly. And how does that port over into these other areas that really have don't have all the resources, but do have a huge amount of need in that area?
Well, that was in fact the motivation for standing up the Information Exchange for Human Services consensus body, which, by the way, don't forget, we have that the first information session for ICFIS coming up tomorrow at noon. So if you haven't already, sign up for it. And I took the extreme measure of actually sending out a little reminder to everybody on the Unify mailing list. So you each should have got it in your inbox in the last half an hour. So click through and register. We already have 60 people signed up to attend. And I don't know, Scott, do we have a limit of how many people we can have?
No, it's well, yeah, but not a number that we'll probably achieve, which I think will be fine. It's GoToWebinar, so it's a bigger number than GoToMeeting. So in any case, one thing I did want to share with you all is, there are direct operators today, that is to say HISPs, that are doing some things in this space already, right? So first of all, we know this in a couple of ways. In our directory, we find food banks. In the directory, you can see that people are communicating with food banks, between food banks and provider organizations already. But one of the things that I found really interesting is in Arkansas, where the health department and the HIE are one and the same. Okay, Arkansas Share is inside the health department. So they have some very special capabilities because of that, right? So they can do some amazing work. They led the league as far as I'm concerned. They send reports by direct to every provider in the state to say, okay, here's who's had a vaccination that you're attributed to. Okay, they communicate that to primary care every day at 5 o'clock. Anybody who's had one today, like it's like practically real-time information. They also, though, have used this in the strictly human services realm. So one of the things they found is that kids that were in foster care who needed to get their medical records moved from one facility to another, the foster care system was getting them from facility and driving them across the state, because there was a state requirement to do it inside of 48 hours, right? So you had to get it over there in 48 hours, and they couldn't think of a way that you could get that data over there safely. So they got it and they printed it out and they carried it. Well, they're using direct secure messaging to communicate from provider to provider in this way, but as directed by social services. Okay, so they're literally so the use case is still a provider to provider use case, but it's driven by the activities of the outside world. They're also interested in doing like death reports, which again are generally in the COVID realm. These death reports are taking 8, 10, 12, 16 weeks to communicate. So like you don't even know who has died in a state like Arkansas. So they want to use direct secure messaging for this. And so these are not healthcare entities that are communicating necessarily. They're just organizations that want to communicate sensitive data.
Well, I think that's what we had originally been talking about within Project Unify and within OCL, was the notion of how could we take advantage of, how could we leverage direct secure messaging for being able to exchange some of this information, whether it's educational information or child welfare information, human services, social services information in general, food insecurity, et cetera. And when we proposed this to the Innovations Priorities Working Group, we actually intentionally kind of focused it down onto those human services that I thought, I'll take ownership of this, that I thought were going to fit in with the mindset of somebody, for instance, from CMS, who wants to be able to pay for home and community-based services like Meals on Wheels or adult daycare.
Yeah.
And as a consequence, we'll have some resonance amongst the healthcare participants within Direct Trust, whereas talking about truancy at schools may not necessarily really, ring anybody's bells within the current stakeholders of Direct Trust. But you get the camel's nose under the tent. And Matt, I know you hate me saying this, using this analogy, but you get the camel's nose under the tent, sooner or later, the rest of the camel will get in there. And that rest of the camel may be, education, it might be child welfare, it could be juvenile justice, who knows?
We just, and just to underline from OpenSea Labs perspective, like, we want to be able to connect at scale to every other community resource referral platform and, the electronic health records. And we don't want to have to pay $20,000 or $30,000 every time we need to integrate with a new system. So that's why taking this kind of standards-based approach of saying, hey, we'll support direct secure messaging, and now every single electronic health record supports direct secure messaging. We could send our referrals over direct. So I guess, Scott, one of the things I wanted to ask you about is, I know that the next version of the directory is being upgraded around the FHIR, the direct directory, right? And then simultaneously within HL7, there's this group meeting to define a FHIR national validated healthcare directory. Mm-hmm. That's, again, a standard, right? Can you read the tea leaves or talk about other, what kind of actual I know that the standard would be able to support both FHIR endpoints, in the national directory, right? And direct secure endpoints messaging. So I guess my question is, like, are there plans and conversations going on between HL7 and Direct Trust around, I guess, like getting to that model of, a national directory of actually kind of actualizing that?
Well, here's what I can tell you is that we are actually tomorrow, it should have been today, but it'll be tomorrow. We're actually signing a contract to build a FHIR R4 directory according to that standard. Okay, so we're building that out now for our own purposes, because we have a federated multi-contributor problem already. Okay, so which is to say, and in fact, it's a multi-tiered federated multi-tiered problem, right? So we have the health systems, the HISPs, Direct Trust. Okay, that's like 3 tiers, right? I've got the health systems that HISPs have multiple health system clients. They get that data from multiple health system clients and curate it. And then the HISPs share those with us, and we have to then curate that and put it together with all the other HISPs data. Now, the problem with that data is that since it comes from multiple contributors, it's really hard to manage the associations that are actually a part of healthcare, unless you actually have enough data in the information that people are providing that you can make the associations. Like the healthcare hierarchy is a very complex thing, right? So you got all these organizations, and it's also dynamic as all get out. There's so many organizations, like a doctor works for multiple health systems, but they also, change places, quickly. So how do we make it so it's very easy to keep this asset up to date for us? And then our thought is also to make this a potential conduit for us to provide that same thing to a national directory if such a thing gets stood up. Now, right now, I'm not 100% sure if the national directory actually does get funded. It's Is it the most important thing ONC is thinking about? Is it, is CMS going to just, pull money out of its wallet and do it? I mean, they certainly have a different budget circumstance than the ONC does. But it isn't clear for certain whether they're going to build a national directory of that sort. But if they do, our goal would be to be a conduit to that directory at a minimum for the direct addresses that are a part of our trust framework, because we're authoritative for that, even if we're authoritative for nothing else. But we also think it's possible that we might be an attestation vehicle for health systems, that they can actually use Direct Trust directory to be the way that they push their data to the national directory if it were to exist. But that is not yet. All this is a thought. This is just a thought at this point. It is not a commitment. The only thing we're doing first is building out a FHIR R4 directory according to the standard, with the ability to support federation from our HISPs.
Do you foresee it supporting FHIR endpoints as well as direct?
Yes, and TIM plus endpoints, trust instant message endpoints, or frankly, any other kinds of technical endpoints that there are in the future. I mean, so being able to find these things and have a reliable way to navigate such a directory that's something we've been working on for the last 5 years. Directories are really darn hard to keep clean. If you've ever managed one, you know that. I know that in the human services space, there are lots of directories. And so I think that the notion that the human services directory componentry could also be built into the Direct Trust directory, that's part of what it is we would like to consider. That would be a change in scope, but it would be a change in scope we would welcome.
So we are officially into overtime here. No, it's great. It only happens when the conversation is vibrant and dynamic. And so I want to thank you for
It usually means
sharing
every
so much
week.
with us. Yeah, right. Double overtime, right? Scott, I know there's a lot more that we're going to want to know about and engage with you going forward. And Direct Trust, I know that Matt and Brian and others and Jim have been interested and will continue to be interested. So thanks for making time. We will share this document relatively soon and look forward to continuing the conversations in some more kind of deeper ways about how do we build this thing out, especially if there's proof of concept opportunities, which I know that there are. We're certainly moving towards to actually demonstrate how we get this done in some meaningful way.
Dan, I'll be glad to share with you my slides. I'll just make a PDF real quick and make sure that so people can get a hold of them if they like.
Thanks. Yeah, we'll be posting this to our hub along with the video for folks who were not able to make it today and who want to sort of brush up on this particular material.
Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks everyone for participating today. And I will see you next week. And I'm sure we'll be talking to many of you during the week. So
Take care.
Thanks so much.
Take care. all.
Take care.
Thanks,
Bye.
Scott.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.